Hi everyone, I'm very happy to welcome you all to our talk today with Gisèle Sapiro. Welcome Gisèle, we're absolutely happy to have you here today. I will give a short introduction. Most of you already know Gisèle, some of you personally, but still I'm going to give you some hints because she's not only sort of a stellar scholar, but also very important to what we're doing here at the CRC Praktiken des Vergleichens, because she, in a way, in different parts of her work, she has always also related what she's doing to different kinds of comparatism, and I will talk about that shortly. So Gisèle Sapiro is Director of Research at the CNRS and Professor of Sociology at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. She studied comparative literature and philosophy in Tel Aviv and then studied sociology in Paris and has received, of course, numerous prizes and fellowships, one of them at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. She is a specialist in the sociology of intellectuals, the sociology of literature, the sociology of the humanities, and the sociology of translation. And in recent years has worked a lot on the international circulation of ideas and has become very, very important in this field. As you know, she works in a Bourdieusian tradition in sociology and is really one of the most prolific and influential scholars in this field. Her work has been translated into many languages, and I will just show this one, which just has been published, The Sociology of Literature with Stanford University Press. So a very important and very interesting work, and a very good introduction also into a sociology of literature. But furthermore, she's also a public intellectual in France who uses her intellectual skills to address questions of utmost cultural importance with a wider French audience in major French newspapers and radio stations, and recently has worked on the symbolic economy of the Nobel Prize in Literature. Yeah? So very important for our project, of course, and we have the great opportunity of meeting her tomorrow at SIF and talk about her recent work on the international circulation and consecration of artworks and the case of prizes and festivals in particular. So you all are invited to join us tomorrow at SIF in the long table room at 3 p.m. So if you're interested, just come by, just join us, and I think we will have a really good time. But today, Gisèle will be talking about isomorphism and differentiation, the global field of cultural production. Chère Gisèle, nous sommes très fiers de t'accueillir ici aujourd'hui et nous sommes très impatients d'écouter ta conférence. Join me in welcoming Gisèle Sapiro today.
Merci beaucoup, Carlos. Vielen Dank. I first apologize that I cannot speak German. I'm trying to relearn, but it takes time. Secondly, I would just like to say that I'm delighted to be back in Bielefeld, where I had cooperation beforehand with Ingrid Holtei. We organized a conference at SIF 20 years ago, so it's really meaningful for me, and I would like especially to thank Carlos, Jürgen, and Max for inviting me to these two meetings, and to give me the opportunity to share some thoughts with this amazing group and project that you're all working on. Bourdieu's field theory is being criticized for its methodological nationalism. I have tried to show elsewhere that nothing in his theory implies that fields are only nationally based. The fact that cultural, professional, educational, and scientific fields started differentiating and becoming autonomous at the national level is a historical fact related to the construction of national identities, but the focus on national fields is a bias that has started to be corrected by works like Pascal Casanova's World Republic of Letters, Larissa Buchholz on the global field of art, and even works on national literatures showing that they can correspond to transnational and bilingual fields, like the case of Algerian literature studies studied by Tristan Leperrier, with whom I also co-edited a special issue of the journal Actes de la Recherche en Sciences Sociales on transnational intellectual fields. I argue that in some cases, like the Négritude, the field of black intellectuals that emerged in the 1950s, the transnational preceded the national, and it's also true for the international organization like the International Sociological Association or International Association of Political Science. In many cases, they preceded the creation of such national associations in many countries. They existed in some countries, but in others they did not exist, and they fostered. And I've been working recently on the ISA, the International Sociological Association. Moreover, in most cases, national fields were built out of a transnational or even global dynamic, as argued by Anne-Marie Thiès. The model for the cultural construction of national identities circulated, the very model you need to have a literature, music, art, and it was imitated from country to country. So imitation, we're here in the comparative frame that you're working on. This is the mechanism I would like to focus on today. How do models and symbolic goods circulate in global markets for cultural goods, and how do they form or not a field of cultural production? So most of my examples will come from my research on the circulation of books, in particular literary works and scholarly books, but we worked with one of my former PhD students, Jérôme Bacouré, comparing flows for literature and cinema, so we can extend this model and try to see how it fits in different art fields. So books are an interesting case because their global circulation very often depends on translation. This operation reveals the limits of Gabriel Part's model of contagion for describing phenomena of circulation of ideas, fashions, or goods. And I mention it because this model has been recently revived and is encouraged by the recourse to big data. The idea that just, ideas circulate by contagion. So this idea of contagion refers to kind of mechanical imitation. And of course, we know that these processes are not mechanical and there are active processes, and I want to show that, and that's the interest to focus on the actors of this circulation. So against the model of contagion, the sociology of culture is interested in the chain of cooperation of actors involved in the circulation of symbolic goods, as well as in the obstacles they face, the struggles that they are involved in, and the way they achieve authority by accumulation of symbolic capital. So again, we have here a selection process which involves comparison, because not everything circulates, of course. There is a selection that is being done. So Bourdieu's field theory provides conceptual tools to understand this mechanism, taking into account the relative autonomy of fields of cultural production with regards to economic and political constraints, but also the heteronomous forces that operate within these fields. Fields are defined, just a short reminder, by a specific capital, specific rules, and specific authorities, such as literary prizes or scientific journals, and in relational topological model, his relational topological model agents' position takings and strategies are related to the position they occupied in the field and to their social disposition. So it's a dynamic model. So in the first part of my presentation, I will display some findings from my empirical research on the structure and regularity that can be observed in the transnational circulation of symbolic goods, again, mainly of translations, and maybe familiar to some of you, but I just use them as an example. And in the second part, I will look at the mechanism of unification of this global market through isomorphism. I will refer to neo-functionalist theory. And lastly, I'll discuss what is left out by neo-functionalist theory and try to bridge it with differentiation logics and with the theory of symbolic capital. So in my research on the circulation of literary works through translation, I have distinguished three levels of observation: the macro, the meso, and the micro. And I contend that the concept of field enables us to move from the macro to the meso and to the micro and back. At the macro level or global level, we can observe quantitative flows. They appear to be asymmetrical, as Johan Held once showed using the index translationum database. The findings fit with world system theory. Books circulate in translation mainly from the central languages to the peripheral ones. And these asymmetries have deepened during the globalization era, contrary to the discourse about globalization. Using other data, I have shown that this applies not only to languages, but also to countries. The centrality of English reflects the centrality of the US and the UK, rather than English-speaking countries, or of France rather than Canada, for instance. But countries may introduce a methodological bias also, because they would mask the role of central cities, such as New York, London, Paris, Berlin since the reunification, but also, of course, Frankfurt or Munich for books, I mean, and so on. As you can see on these tables showing the concentration of translation in French-speaking and English-speaking area, the French is the most centralized around Paris. So these cities are global, not only from the standpoint of what they offer or import, but also by their central role in the global circulation of symbolic goods through export. This is also why they attract cultural producers, for instance, the post-colonial authors who get internationally recognized are those who publish in these central cities. So what we see about the diversity, the growing diversity of the literary marketplace is hiding the fact that those that get recognized are published in the central cities. And for instance, Claire Ducournau showed for Francophone African authors that it's those who publish in Paris that get internationally recognized. Actually, the centrality of these cities is tightly linked to the centrality of certain firms, publishers in the case of books. And this centrality is based not only on economic capital, but also on symbolic capital. So, for instance, I worked on the Gallimard publisher. So it's the most prestigious French publisher, you know the name, which has a consecrating power not only at the national but also at the international or the global level, as attested by the number of literary works translated from the number of Nobel Prize winners in its catalog. You can see this. I think of all publishers in the world, Gallimard has the most. So, and for instance, I also found out that doing a kind of quantitative research of what is translated from French in the US in the 1990s, I found out that Gallimard, its share of books translated into English was 29% of the literary books translated into English. So it's huge. You see the second one coming behind is Le Seuil with 7%. So it's a huge gap. And this capacity of exporting literary works is less a function of economic capital than of symbolic capital. And this symbolic logic is also evidenced by the fact that Éditions de Minuit, a very small publisher who published Beckett and the Nouveau Roman in the 50s and still focuses on avant-garde writing, comes third on the list with 5%. It comes before publishers that are larger than Minuit. The same logic can be observed when turning to the circulation of scholarly books. The first French exporting publisher is now Le Seuil and not Gallimard, though at a lower rate. You can see 16% of the books translated from French into English in the years 2000. So you can see it indicates a relative autonomy of the fields. So Gallimard is first in literature, but not in the social sciences and humanities or scholarly books. And it comes only on the second place. And then you can see the third one is a very, very small publisher, it's Galilée. Maybe you never heard about it, but it's there because it's Derrida's publisher. And then it attracted also all the tradition of Derrida, and then it's the third most translated publisher in English. I just want to show the German publishers who are translated into French. So this is based on the research I published in Mittelweg. So you can see that here you can see the centrality of Surkamp in exporting scholarly books towards France. At this macro level, we thus observe functioning of the global market for translation, which is embedded in the global book market. This market, which emerged in the 17th century and organized by the end of the 19th, had its rules with the copyright laws and its institutions, the international book fairs, which have multiplied since the 1980s. Some, like Frankfurt and London, play a more central role in this global market than others, like Ouagadougou, Delhi, or Guadalajara. Within this market, we can observe the specific logics of the literary field. For instance, the consecrated power of Gallimard in relation with specific authorities such as the Nobel Prize, which contributes to unify this global field and organize a specific competition between nations, as argued by Casanova, and the paper by Carlos and Jürgen on Olympic internationalism shows how this competition was instantiated in practice through systematic comparisons of performances in various domains. We can also observe the specific logics of the intellectual field, which encompasses scholarly books and non-fiction books by intellectuals, essays, and the two genres are not clearly distinguished in publishing, and this has an impact on the academic field because the intellectual agenda is in large part imposed by this global circulation of books. So maybe what circulates, what is translated from Surkamp in French, from scholarly work in Germany would not reflect what you would have in mind as what is important, what is happening now in the field and is important. So there is this logic of the publishing field which goes towards more now successful books or trade books or books with agents and so whatever. We can talk about this later if you want. Now to the meso level. So the meso level allows us to change the focus from exportation to importation and from flows to publishers' catalogs. We then observe that the flows of translation are not distributed randomly across publishers nor across series. So using Bourdieu's theory of the publishing field, especially the distinction between the pole of large-scale circulation and the pole of small-scale circulation, which translates in the publisher's terminology by the classification opposing commercial books to upmarket books. So I've heard that from people in publishing, commercial books versus upmarket books, within which you have other classifications such as very commercial. So one of the publishers, the editors told me, oh, when you hear very commercial, then you're really afraid of that. So then I was able to show that languages are not evenly distributed between these two poles. So translations of fiction books from English dominate at the pole of large-scale circulation. The series of bestsellers, thrillers, mysteries, romantic novel, and so on. It's almost everything translated from English. So that's the case in French, but also in other languages. But if you go to the pole of small-scale circulation, then you find that there is a much higher diversity of languages for literature, especially because literature is much more diverse than other sectors like the scholarly books, where you have mostly 5 or 6 languages that get really translated. So, for instance, Gallimard's series Du Monde Entier for foreign literature, they have in their catalog 30 languages and 40 countries, more than 30 languages and 40 countries that are represented. The genres are not evenly distributed either. The more commercial genres are separated from upmarket literature in catalogs, in the list, the publisher's list. And in large conglomerates, the differentiation may occur at the level of imprints, as I observed in American publishing field. So you can have an imprint for upmarket literature in the same conglomerate and in the same group, and one which is more for paperback. I guess it's the same thing in Germany. And then there is a kind of inner division of labor, and then you can see connections between the two. But then you can also see that if you look at this graph, and we won't get into the details, so this is a graph of the American publisher who published books translated from French. And you can distinguish the squares, it's more independent publishers, the rounds, it's university presses, and the diamonds is the imprints in conglomerates. And so you can see that the conglomerates focus on reprinting classics, because this is the less risky and most rentable, the most profitable operation, while those who invest in contemporary, independent, contemporary fiction and more innovative things is definitely the independent publishers. And university presses also, they contribute to classicize the modern literature and a very small number of upmarket imprints, which were formerly very important literary publishers, still do some translations. They would do the Goncourt, for instance. Marie Ndiaye was published with Knopf. Only when she won the Goncourt, not before. And the same can be said of non-fiction genres and disciplines. Biographies are, as you know, the more commercial genre, and it's more likely to be published by trade publishers in the US, whereas scholarly books are often confined to university presses. And in France, trade publishers still publish scholarly books, despite the fact that the Anglo-American model of publishing is being progressively imported, and it's the case, I know, in Germany. So here we also see a circulation of a model of publishing, which is interesting also for the comparison reflection. You have also the history of the circulating of avant-garde publishing to the US through Richard Seaver and such people, because I interviewed him, so he got interested in Beckett, and then he was interested with the model of Edition Minuit and so on. But then you have the circulation of now this very trade model. to Europe. I just wanted to, to show the dispersion of the publication of French. So it's interesting to look at the geography of circulation also. You have in Paris, in French, concentration of the translation in Paris. But if you look at the United States and the literature in the United States, it's not the scholarly book, you will see this dispersion. Why? Because the academic presses are investing in translating also literature, not only scholarly books. So to understand now the reasons underlying this uneven but not random distribution, we have to turn to agents' strategies. So agents, publishers, literary agents, translators, authors, academics, and so on, which is the micro level. And here the materials for the research would be publishers and agents, literary agents, archives, interviews, observation in book fairs, for instance, and participant observation in literary events, book presentations, and so on. And we can also follow the trajectory of single titles and the reception, their reception across the world. So there are some interesting work being done this way. And we could go back to the meso level by comparing their reception in different countries. So of course, individual agent strategies are constrained by the meso level, the field logics, which manifests itself through their position in the field. If you are running the foreign literature series at Gallimard, you have a wider range of possibilities and choice, so more room of maneuver than if you are a very small publisher devoid of economic and symbolic capital. But the Gallimard editor is also constrained by the history of the house. For instance, the authors who are already in the catalogue, like Philippe Roth, and the acquisition strategy of new authors in peripheral languages can be limited by economic considerations. However, studying Gallimard's catalogue, I showed that the number of translated language in its foreign literature series grew significantly from the 1950s to the 1960s. The number of languages rose from 14 to 24, the number of countries from 23 to 38. So these numbers grew significantly in the globalization era, especially in the 1990s, and it rose to, as I said before, around 40 languages and 57, it's more than what I said earlier, 57 countries. And I argue that this logics of linguistic differentiation of their catalogue, because we differentiate the languages that are represented, which increases cultural diversity, resulted from the new competition in the publishing field with the rise of small publishers specializing in translation by the end of the 1970s. They appeared in France, especially, there was Métellier, but especially Actes Sud, because Actes Sud, it's an interesting story. It's a publishing house focusing on translation, built its catalogue through translation, and it was launched by a Belgian publisher who settled in Arles and not in Paris in order to counter the centrality of Paris, and who strove to multiply the languages represented in his catalogue, and got also aid from the governments for that. So you see that there is this competition and struggle going on. And then the differentiation of languages was imitated by this larger established series of Gallimard, Le Seuil, and others. So specific competition is a characteristic of fields, but of course there are other forces at play. So in the former article published in the Journal of World Literature, I distinguished 4 kinds of factors favoring or hindering the circulation of literary works in translation. Some of them imposing heteronomous constraints on the field, others defending its autonomy. So we have economic factors, the circulation of cultural goods in general and of books in translation in particular depend on the market and thus depend in large part on economic considerations of profitability. And the global circulation of bestsellers best illustrate this market logic. Think of the Da Vinci Code, or 50 Shades of Grey. But economic constraints have stiffened in the globalization era due to the concentration of publishing around large conglomerates. And then you have the political and ideological factors such as censorship that may hinder the circulation of cultural goods, but propaganda or the promotion of ideology may also favor it, like the circulation of social realist novels in the communist countries. So there was, for instance, a Stalin Prize for literature. And then you have the cultural dimension. So I just mentioned the specific values of the cultural fields under consideration, but there are other cultural dimensions like religious or can be identity. So for instance, I found in the Gallimard archive a note by Gaston Gallimard saying that he would continue to publish Faulkner despite the indifference, and he used the word, of the French public, because he believed in his literary value. And it was in the 30s, the best sale for one of Faulkner's book was less than 4,000 copies. It was Sanctuary, As I Lay Dying was 1,000 copies. So if you compare to Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, which sold 800,000 copies at the same moment, then you see that continuing to invest on Faulkner is not for economic consideration. And this double logic reflects what Bourdieu defined as the economy of symbolic goods, small speculation betting on consecration on the long term. So Faulkner will get the Nobel Prize in 1949, but the fact that Gallimard published it also contributed to that. And at the same time, there is this logic of equalization, péréquation, that Margaret Mitchell would fund Faulkner somehow by making the economy of on the short term function. And then there are social constraints that reveal the unequal access to the transnational literary field according to gender, ethnicity, or race, minority, subaltern status, geographic origins, periphery versus center, as attested by a very simple analysis of the Nobel Prize winners. We'll talk about this tomorrow, but you can see just for gender that there were only 6 women who won the Nobel Prize in Literature until 1990, and since then there are many more, but there were women writing, so it's not that they were not there. And it's the same thing, it was not before 1986 that a black author, Wally Soyinka, won the Nobel, and 1988 an Arab author, Naguib Mahfouz. And apart from Tagore, who won it in 1913, the only non-Western author who won the Nobel until 45, he was the only one until 1945, until Gabriela Mistral was awarded the prize. So now I would like to combine market logic with fields and institutions in order to understand the circulation of cultural goods, both products and models, and both organizational models and creative models. So Casanova has analyzed the unification of the World Republic of Letters around the time factor. She calls it the Greenwich Meridian, and she has stressed the consecrating power of a city, Paris, at least until the 1970s, and the role of the Nobel Prize as an authority. And focusing on the authors, she left out of her analysis the role of cultural intermediaries, literary agents, publishers, scouts, or events also, such as book fairs and literature festivals, or international organizations such as UNESCO, and also the market logics. So without challenging her powerful analysis, which works for, if you consider the authors, it really works very well, I would like to reintroduce all these agents, events, and institutions that were left aside in a broader sociological model, which would help us understand cultural evolution, the circulation of cultural goods, and the making of a word canon. Franco Moretti uses 2 evolutionary models, waves and trees, for the history of literature. I would like to argue from a sociological perspective that they can be explained by 2 contrasting processes, isomorphism and differentiation. So isomorphism, and I'm relying now on neo-institutional sociological, sorry I said not neo-fiction, it's neo-institutional sociological theory, which results from three types of mechanisms: constraint, imitation, and professional norms. So I refer to DiMaggio and Powell's 1983 paper, and these mechanisms apply to the conditions of the production of cultural goods. So constraint acts as the main homogenizing instrument in, so I'm transposing, they're not working on cultural production at all, that's not it has not been, I mean, there is one using it for publishing, but the imitation model. So constraint acts as the main homogenizing instrument in authoritarian regimes. Scientific materialism and the canon of socialist realism were in large part imposed by the USSR and the other communist regimes. The Russian production was dominant in this canon, as the USSR exerted hegemony over these countries, and it also provided a method of creation for writers and artists. The works were also translated in Western countries through the Soviet Literary Agency, a state agency which monopolized the rights for the exportation of Soviet literature. They disseminated the work through communist networks and publishers, but also interacted with Western trade publishers, thus controlling the exportation and circulation of what was produced in the USSR. So this model started being challenged after the 1956, though by illegal channels and informal networks. And I refer here to Johanna Poppa's work. Another example is the pressure that the German occupying forces exerted on the French publishers during the Second World War, during the occupation, to translate German works, all the while forbidding translations from English in France and also from French into German. But their impact was more limited in time since, of course, the occupation lasted only 4 years. At the same time, I said translation from French into German were forbidden, apart of few exceptions, so it was like a reward for collaborationists to get translated into German. So you can see the use of translation for political ideological purposes. And the aim was very clearly put that it was to end French hegemony, French cultural hegemony. So there are archives that can find the statements from the occupying, the Nazi regime. Religious control also exerts constraints, of course, through censorship and labeling of recommended readings, the imprimatur. Now, imitation is typical of competitive free markets. Publishers will give preference to successful genres, as Moretti showed with the cyclical waves of sub-genres in the 19th century. I don't know if you have the, I showed the curves, can you show, no. Sorry, here are the wave, the waves, and to works already selected by their peers in other countries. In order to reduce uncertainty, you will rely on the fact that a work has already got success in another countries. So this is the thesis by Franzen and Kuppers in a paper published in 2013. And in interviews, publishers told me indeed that they are influenced by the fact that a work has already been translated in other languages, despite the fact that they know that the reception in one country does not have an impact on and cannot predict the success of the book in another country. So we have examples of Jean-Philippe Toussaint, who is a big star in Japan, and in the US he's almost unknown, published by a very small publisher. And so in the imitation logic, the publishers who and of course here you see the mechanism of comparison, the possible replication of the success. So this idea of, but publishers that produce worldwide bestsellers have a marketing plan which includes usually the publication of the translation, for instance, in Europe, all at the same time, so they can tour the author at the same time, so it's all rationalized, you know. I saw one of these plans, one of the publishers showed me, it was a book like this, the promotion plan. So imitation also concerns organizational models of publishing and the division of labor. So the rise of private literary agents starting in the 1930s introduced a new division of labor in the publishing industry by externalizing the function of discovery and of the international and intermediate circulation of works. I mean, adaptations to cinema, for instance, or theater. But this new division of labor concerned mostly the Anglo-American field at the time. And this model started to circulate in Europe in the 60s, 70s, and it was first imported in Spain and more recently in Germany in the 1990s, now in France, although it's still not really working there, and it changed the whole functioning of the field. In the globalization era, this model, the circulation of this model through a kind of imitation. In the globalization era, this model challenged that of state agencies, which existed. I mentioned the Soviet literary agency, but the state agencies also existed in small countries. So, for instance, Israel and the Netherlands and some Scandinavian countries, also in France since the 1980s, in order to promote their literature abroad. There is also in Germany, but it's more focused on scholarly works initially, on the liberal. Now I think it's changing, and there is a policy of supporting translations also of literary works, but you will tell me. So, for instance, in Israel, the state agency for the translation of Hebrew literature changed its working methods and adopted the model of a private literary agent with a catalogue and an attempt to adjust to the demands of the local markets. So first they worked like an agency, a state agency with their agenda and then they saw they cannot reach the public, and they needed to adapt to the logics of the markets to change their tools. And then they imitated the private agents. And this leads us to professional norms, which are increasingly imposed by the dominant agents. In an interview I did with the head of this Israeli state agency, she talked of professional norms, and by the same token, the French Publishers Agency has adopted the professional norms of private agencies. So professional norms first spread around the world through so the professional norms around the world through professional organizations, such as in our case, the Association Littéraire et Artistique, founded in 1878 to promote literary and artistic property. The Publishers International Union, founded in 1896, which is tied to national publishers unions, and the Pen Club, established in 1921, which has local sections in each country. And the Publishers International Union imposed, in particular, the respect of copyright law, which is the first professional norm unifying this global market. In the interwar period, of course, some refused to, the Soviet Union refused to stick to adhere to this convention, the Bern and then the Geneva Convention. In the interwar period, specific agents started specializing in international exchanges, press agencies, public and private literary agents, translators. So you see all these actors acting in parallel. I can see that in the archives, the publishing archives. And in 50s, 60s, when the exchanges intensified, large publishers reorganized and founded specific departments for foreign rights. Different models of division of labor coexist. So you have the selling of rights that can be undertaken internally by somebody who is hired by the publisher, a publisher's employee, or it can be externalized to a co-agent of the publisher. And it can be held by the author themselves, represented by their agent, or by a co-agent. Some authors keep the right for some specific languages where they have networks and or direct contacts with publishers. Private literary agents have become dominant in the global market and have contributed to redefine and harmonize the professional norms of different national publishing fields in the globalization era. And as I said, in Germany it started in the 1990s. However, these norms may vary within the field of publishing between the poles of large-scale circulation and small-scale circulation. For instance, the norm of direct translation and faithfulness to the original work, two norms that have become widespread in upmarket publishing, do not apply in more commercial genre, entailing a great divergence between the original and the translation in this market segment, but making the final product more resembling to the national equivalents. So I think this idea of different norms is interesting because then you have the norm of translation of faithfulness, which was, by the way, I think largely needs to be studied by, but imposed by, especially by the German literary field, because the idea of the faithfulness to original was really theorized in Germany, while in French and English the idea of adaptation was it's always the most dominant language tend to be have a much more domesticating strategy, and by the time Germany was struggling, German literature and publishing was struggling to impose themselves, and translation was one of these tools. So this norm of direct translation applies only in one segment and not the other, and the commercial genre, the contrary, the adaptive, the domesticating model prevails. Literary agents also contribute to the professionalization of writers by imposing that they be paid for lectures and interventions in festivals. So this is another aspect of professional norms that are developing. In France, all the organizers of events were very surprised to have to pay authors for, I mean, everybody in a festival is paid apart from the author usually, and now it's, there is a group of festivals that joined and started also defending the idea that the author should be paid. So this mechanism does allow to account for some of the homogenizing logics within the global market of publishing or the global field of higher education. So this was about isomorphism, but now I would like to briefly challenge this model and that I have introduced in this system, the way thinking the global culture field, but I would like to highlight what these mechanisms do not account for and for which we need field theory. And there are three major phenomena that these mechanisms do not account for. It's conflict and struggles, differentiation logic through distinction, symbolic capital, which creates uneven power relations, and cultural policies. So conflict and struggle may occur first between these mechanisms themselves or within them. Whereas constraint prevailed via state monopoly within the USSR and its satellite countries, this model was challenged at the transnational level by the market logics and by professional norms. These conflicting logics, informed by politics and by cultural policies, supported the heterodox and even heretic cultural production that was produced in the margins of the system or in the underground in these countries. At the same time, the market logics can be counterbalanced by the state through censorship or public cultural policies like financial aid, and to the small-scale production publishing, like in France, the translation grants for upmarket literature and scholarly books, which are in favor of linguistic diversity against the domination of English. So there is in France a policy of supporting translations from other languages into French in order to guarantee a kind of linguistic diversity in French language. Within these different mechanisms, conflict may also occur, resisting homogenizations. This can be the case for professional norms. For instance, the French copyright law droit d'auteur, which was adopted by the Berne Convention, considers moral rights as inalienable, whereas in the American copyright law, you can sell your moral rights. And for this reason, the United States never joined the Berne Convention. This means that the ownership of the moral rights must be negotiated in contracts. And these negotiations take place within uneven power relations. Since American publishing became dominant since the 1970s, American publishers tried to impose their norms. And it's interesting to see the archives of French publishers used to send contracts in French. But by the mid-1990s, the larger and most established publishers switched to English, and some of them recruited Anglo-American native speakers, because nobody spoke English there, in their foreign rights departments to be able to lead these negotiations and understand the issues at stake. I think it happened the same in Germany, but in Germany I find, for instance, letters in French before the 1990s, or there were already many languages in the exchange. The droit d'auteur still prevails in negotiations between members of the Berne Convention. Thus, two norms coexist in the global market. So beyond the professional norms, competition does not only produce imitation, but also differentiation through distinction. So differentiation logics, so creative industries are industries of prototype. Isomorphism cannot be complete in the sense that each book must be different. You cannot replicate the same. You want the same success, but you cannot replicate the same book. Even in the most standardized genre, like thrillers and sentimental novels. Plagiarism is the borderline case and is banned by copyright laws. So this is all the more true in the global market. Each translation is different from the original. So even the text, it's different. It's in another language, it's a different text. And from each other, each translation is different from one another, although it is attributed to the same author. Yeah, Flaubert is the author of sentimental novel, L'éducation sentimentale, and all the novels, all the translation of his novel in any languages. So this is because the symbolic value granted to authorship in our societies has so much value. So this is the system of authorship. Moreover, in his article on the social conditions of the international circulation of ideas, Bourdieu invites us to change the focus from the original field to the field of reception and to the role of importers in the selection, marking, and interpretation of foreign products, be it books, theories, or ideas. It is true also for models. Their circulation is not simple imitation. It is never mechanical mimicry, but active appropriation. Appropriation introduces differentiation through the hybridization of genre and cultural traditions, as Apadorai argued against the idea that globalization would be mere homogenizing. More specifically to the history of literature, Franco Moretti argued for the circulation of the genre of the novel that it implied a hybridization with local materials. Moretti, I would say also with forms, but local forms, but Moretti also delineates a history of literary models as differentiation resembling the evolutionary trees that we saw before. One can say the same of the circulation of academic models. Their implementation in a new environment entails adaptation, of the model and of its signification in the new system, which might differ from the original. So if we focus, so you see, you compare, you want to bring a model, but then it becomes something else. So the differentiation is here something meaningful, and it's not simple isomorphism. And if we focus now on genre, subgenre, and literary models, we could measure the variations that occur from one item to another. It is being done with the big data, but it is more difficult to measure across languages. One could compare the evolution of the genre over time and from place to place, like Moretti does with the device of free and direct speech. I would like to argue that since the norms of upmarket publishing clearly stem from the literary and academic fields, where originality has been a central value since Romanticism, differentiation will be privileged at the pole of small-scale circulation, rather than isomorphism. So, for instance, I just did this excerpt of an interview with a publisher that I won't read, but you can see that the values are not about imitation, it's about differentiation. Whereas at the pole of large-scale circulation, the isomorphic tendency, imitating the successful formulas, prevails in order to reduce uncertainty and maximize the chance of profit. The norm of originality applies first of all to authors who have to distinguish themselves, make a name for themselves, accumulate symbolic capital. So their symbolic capital is encapsulated in their proper name, which functions as what Saul Kripke's defined as a rigid designator. So the same, it refers for a body of works, Kripke doesn't speak about authors and works, but the author the author name can be substituted with Flaubert is the author of Madame Bovary, of sentimental novel, so it always refers to the same person. And this is what Foucault has called the author function. And so the author's name can become a brand name or a fetish. But publishers also need to construct their identity. So it's not only authors who have to differentiate themselves and be original and from the others in this competition, this field competition. It's also the publishers. They need to construct their identity, become a brand name or a label in order to occupy an identifiable position in the book market. For example, some publishers, though small, accumulated symbolic capital by gathering avant-garde literary groups such as Éditions de Minuit that I mentioned with Beckett and the Nouveau Roman, and their name encloses their symbolic capital, that is to say, their catalogue and list of renowned authors. So the signification of publishing brand names in the world market for symbolic goods is related to their symbolic capital, which refers to their backlist, their renowned authors, their Nobel Prize winners that they show on their websites, like Gallimard, and so on. So they have an identity that they build and they market. And then for an author that is being translated in French would prefer to be translated with Gallimard rather than with Lafont. The principle of distinction also applies to nation states, so differentiation, which all claim since the 19th century that their literature embodies their cultural identity. And also the national brand still works as a distinctive label on the globalized book market. French literature, for instance, is still a brand in this market, despite the fact that it can refer to a very heterogeneous group of authors. So you can see the nationalities of authors translated from French in English in the US in the 1990s. There are 30 nationalities, but it's labeled French literature from the French standpoint. It's more complicated from the American one. So So this branding, German literature, Italian literature, it's still, Brazilian literature is still working. It's still a kind of differentiation in the market. And the long-lasting prominence of the national as a category of literary classification, despite the globalization process, despite also the emergence of multinational corporations and the growing isomorphism at the core of large-scale production of the transnational field of publishing, is revelatory of this differentiation logic. Differentiation also applies to the post-colonial exotic defined by Graham Hagen as the global spectacularization of cultural differences. So it showed that there were specific strategies of post-colonial authors to impose themselves in the Western market. Now, symbolic capital, the theory of isomorphism by imitation, does not answer the question of who imitates whom and why. And I talked about this with Paul DiMaggio, and he agreed with this point. Actually, imitation occurs neither mechanically nor randomly. Publishers tend to follow the choices of some of their foreign peers rather than others. You would ask them, they all will mention the names of those that they are interested in their catalogs. And they often admit in interviews that they are looking at these names, these foreign peers. And they also tend to work with specific agents who know their list and taste, a knowledge that is the specific symbolic capital of these transnational intermediaries, these agents, scouts, foreign rights departments, and that some national agencies have also acquired. So, for instance, the head of the Israel book agency, she would know which author to propose to which French publisher because she knew the market. And the same applies to the French agent from the Bureau du French Institute in Israel who proposed to publishers different kinds of authors. So you can see that there are elective affinities which express identities and thus distinction. Some editors have direct contacts and relationship with their foreign counterparts and exchange information at book fairs or by phone, email, and so on, and they form a kind of transnational editorial network. These networks rely in large part on the symbolic capital of the publishers and of the editors. For instance, I could observe regular exchange between certain American university presses and French publishers. The University of Chicago Press bought more than 3 titles from Le Seuil, Gallimard, and Fayard between 1990 and 2007, so you can see regular exchanges. Sometimes these networks are mediated by authors endowed with a great amount of symbolic capital. For instance, during the same period, Stanford University Press released 24 titles by Derrida purchased from Galilée. Similarly, 11 of the 15 titles by Kristeva translated with Columbia University Press were originally published by Fayard, and so on. Symbolic capital, of course, enhances the chances for an author to be translated, as you can tell from this list of French authors translated in the US. And the same applies to the publisher. You can see those Anglo-American publishers who are most translated into French for the period covered. And you can see it's really related to their symbolic capital, and when you match the two sides, it's not equivalent. I mean, Cambridge University Press does not translate, come first for translation from French. So you see the asymmetry of the circulation. So the capacity of a publisher to export works in translation depends on its symbolic capital, at least at the core of small-scale circulation. And if you take this list, you will find a familiar hierarchy of symbolic capital. The importation of a foreign cultural product is a strategy of distinction within a national field. It can serve to accumulate symbolic capital and even build strategy for subverting the local field, as Pascal Casanova showed in many cases. I can mention the example of Sartre's usages of Faulkner in order to contest the 19th century novelistic devices, time, omniscient, narrator. So again, the import-data circulation is done to differentiate. For an academic who runs a series, translation may be also a means to accumulate symbolic capital, all the while promoting some intellectual innovations, as illustrated by the list of translations in Bourdieu's series Le Sens Commun at Éditions 2008 during the first period, 65 until 78, when he translated a lot. And you can see the diversity of the translations and the names. Radical publishers in France and the UK use foreign theories in a critical perspective. For instance, French theory in the UK, post-colonial and gender studies in France. Struggle may occur around the appropriation of foreign authors, such is the case of Max Weber in France. There is, I know it's also in the US, but in France it's a real fight. You know, Weber was first promoted by Raymond Aron and the anti-Marxist conservative thinkers under the label of methodological individualism against structuralism. All the while he was being used by Bourdieu in a structural manner with his theory of religion, especially. And of course, all these struggles are very interesting to study because then you see what is at stake in the field. And in the 1990s, some books by Weber were translated or retranslated in a more progressist version, which is much closer to Bourdieu theory. Now, last point, the cultural policies. I don't have the slide. Preparing this talk, I was wondering whether cultural policies should be integrated as part of professional norms, but I arrived to the conclusion that it cannot be reduced to professional ethics. For instance, in the 1950s, UNESCO launched a program in support of translations from non-Western cultures in order to catalyze what they called literary interpenetration. I've been working on these archives, and this program encouraged editors and publishers to start translating classical and modern works from Asia and Latin America, expanding the borders of the international market for translations from Europe to the world, because it was very much concentrated in Europe. This program thus enabled this peripheral literature, peripheral on this side of the globe, to accumulate symbolic capital and become recognized players in this global market. For instance, it contributed to the boom of Latin American literature, together, of course, with the role played by the first Spanish agent, Carmen Balcells, who represented Gabriel Garcia Marquez, among others, who won the Nobel Prize. Although the exchanges across languages and countries are still asymmetrical, despite this program, which was abandoned by UNESCO in the 80s. And you can tell that there are whole areas like sub-Saharan Africa, which are excluded from these exchanges. I also mentioned state policies supporting translation. States act as agents participating in the international competition between nation states that started by the mid-19th century and is still occurring with the global market, although they have been relatively marginalized in the globalization era and have now to adopt the rules of the market. Still, due to the translation costs, the chance to be translated for peripheral literature is bigger if it can get funding from its home country. And if there is an active network of export-import agents, state agency translators, critics, academics, who advocate for it. And this is the reason why Dutch and modern Hebrew literature have been able to maintain a significant presence in the globalization era. Some of these policies may have political aims, such as promoting some ideas. Cultural diversity is one of them. In the US, the advocacy in favor of translation became a political and cultural cause undertaken by the American Pen Club with the support of a network of publishers. So this excerpt will show this. I won't read it, but just you can see the translation as a political cause. Another example, the American State Department, as you perhaps know, funded the translation of classics of liberal thought toward the communist countries and are still doing that towards the Arab world. This is neither constraint nor professional norms, it is cultural policy and politics, like the promotion of cultural diversity. We can also think of the role of UNESCO played, the role UNESCO played in the circulation of the academic model, so the academic institutionalization of sociology and political science, as I said, as a discipline after World War II, resulted from this incitement which aimed at pacifying international relations and promoting democratic values. So to conclude, we can conclude that the logic of the market does not spread in a homogeneous way. It encounters resistance, and imitation is never mechanical, but always appropriation and differentiation to a certain extent, plagiarism being the borderline case. Moretti, as already said, distinguishes these two evolutionary models, waves and trees. I would like to argue that while the mechanisms favoring isomorphism translate into homogenizing waves, especially at the pole of large-scale production, the differentiation process induces offshoots that shape trees, especially at the pole of small-scale production. So swamped by the mass market, the pole of small-scale production constantly resurfaces and extends its ramifications. But contrary to Moretti, I would not speak of a cultural evolution in the biological sense of adaptation. Here we have cultural agents developing strategies within a given set of constraints to which they have to adjust. Strategies is Bourdieu's concept for describing individuals' improvisation within a set of constraints. This concept is opposed to both rational choice theory, the abstract notion of preferences, and to functionalist mechanical models, such as explaining the circulation of cultural groups by needs. Do you really need Faulkner in France in the 1930s? So what does need mean in this case? So individual strategies can be studied through their choices, beliefs, and justification, and through the constraints they face. The two contradictory tendencies to isomorphism and differentiation occur in a competitive space where symbolic, economic, and social capital is unevenly distributed, a situation that produces conflict and incite cultural policies. Thanks for attention.